June 14, 1944. The grey waters of the English Channel churned beneath the hull of LST-325 as it carried its human cargo away from the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy. In the ship's cramped hold, 43 German soldiers sat in stunned silence, their uniforms still caked with Norman soil, their minds reeling from the swift collapse of their defensive positions. The acrid smell of cordite lingered on their clothing, mixing with the salt spray that penetrated the vessel's steel walls. Among them sat Obergefreiter Hans Müller, a 22-year-old Wehrmacht veteran whose calloused hands still trembled from the morning's artillery barrage. As the English coastline emerged from the mist ahead, he pressed his back against the cold metal bulkhead and closed his eyes, bracing himself for what he was certain would be his final journey. The significance of this moment extended far beyond the personal fate of these 43 men. They were among the first wave of what would become over 400,000 German prisoners of war to reach British shores, the largest influx of enemy captives in Britain's history. Their arrival marked not merely another logistical challenge for a nation already stretched thin by 5 years of total war, but a crucial test of British character and democratic values. How Britain treated these men would echo through history, influencing post-war reconciliation, shaping international law, and revealing profound truths about the nature of civilized warfare. These prisoners carried with them not only the physical wounds of battle, but the psychological burden of Nazi indoctrination teachings that had prepared them for a very different kind of captivity than what awaited them on British soil. The expectations burned into their minds had been forged in the propaganda furnaces of the Third Reich. For years, Goebbels' ministry had painted the British as merciless imperialists who showed no quarter to their enemies. Wehrmacht training films depicted Allied soldiers as brutal opportunists who tortured prisoners for information before executing them. Hans Müller, like thousands of his comrades, had been told that capture meant death, if not immediately, then through slow starvation in barbaric prison camps. The Nazi propaganda machine had systematically prepared German soldiers to fight to the death rather than surrender, describing British captivity as a fate worse than an honorable battlefield demise. Officers instructed their men that British guards would strip them of all dignity, forcing them into slave labor while denying them basic medical care. The mental image these soldiers carried was one of concrete cells, meager rations, and the constant threat of violence from vengeful captors whose cities had been bombed, whose ships had been torpedoed, whose empire had been challenged by German U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers. Yet as the LST's engines fell silent and the loading ramp lowered at Portsmouth Harbor, Hans Müller encountered something that contradicted everything he had been taught to expect. British military police, wearing crisp uniforms and carrying themselves with professional bearing, directed the German prisoners with firm but respectful commands. No one struck them. No one screamed obscenities or threats. Instead, they were handed cups of hot tea, actual tea, not the ersatz substitutes that had become common even in German rations. A British sergeant, speaking halting German learned during his own education, explained the basic procedures they would follow. The Red Cross symbol was prominently displayed on medical stations where German wounded received the same attention as Allied casualties. As Hans looked around the harbor, he saw British soldiers sharing cigarettes with German prisoners, gesturing toward ships and buildings while engaging in broken conversations that bridged the language barrier through simple human curiosity. The historical record provides overwhelming evidence of this fundamental disconnect between expectation and reality. Lieutenant Colonel A.P. Scotland, who oversaw interrogation procedures, noted in his classified reports that newly arrived German prisoners consistently expressed astonishment at their treatment. The majority arrive expecting immediate execution or, at best, prolonged torture. Scotland wrote in June 1944, when offered medical attention and adequate rations. Many initially refuse, believing these to be preliminary steps in some elaborate psychological torment. The International Red Cross, conducting regular inspections of British POW facilities, reported conditions that exceeded Geneva Convention requirements in virtually every category. German prisoners received the same basic rations as British soldiers, supplemented by Red Cross parcels. Medical facilities in POW camps often provided better care than what was available to German civilians in bombed-out cities. Dr. Wilhelm Struer, a German military physician captured at Cannes, wrote in his secret diary, "I have been appointed to oversee medical care for our men in this camp. The British have provided me with medical supplies that we have not seen in our own field hospitals for over a year. They treat our wounded with the same priority as their own." This transformation of perception began almost immediately upon arrival at British reception centers. The massive processing facility at Kempton Park Racecourse, where thousands of German prisoners were initially housed, defied every expectation these men had carried from the battlefield. Instead of overcrowded cells, they found themselves in converted stable buildings that had been modified with proper heating, lighting, and sanitation facilities. Rather than starvation rations, they received meals that many later described as superior to what they had eaten during their final months in the German army. The British military's adherence to Geneva Convention protocols was so thorough that it occasionally frustrated intelligence officers seeking rapid information. Prisoners could not be coerced or threatened during interrogation. They were required to provide only name, rank, and serial number. Those who chose to cooperate with Allied intelligence did so voluntarily, often motivated not by fear, but by a growing recognition that their captors treated them with a dignity their own army had rarely shown to enemy prisoners. The symbolic power of British abundance became embodied in the simple ritual of afternoon tea. Every day at precisely 4 o'clock, regardless of weather or workload, British guards would distribute tea to German prisoners working in fields, construction sites, and factories across the United Kingdom. This daily ceremony represented something far more profound than mere refreshment. Tea, that most quintessentially British tradition, became a symbol of civilized order, of maintained routine, of the democratic value placed on human dignity, regardless of nationality or allegiance. Hans Müller, working on a farm in Yorkshire 3 months after his capture, would later write to his sister, "Every afternoon, the British Guard stops our work and brings us tea. Real tea, not the bark tea we drank in our trenches. He asks about our families, shows us photographs of his children, talks about the weather and the crops. For 30 minutes each day, we are not prisoners and captors. We are simply men sharing tea and conversation." This small ritual has taught me more about the English character than all of Goebbels' speeches taught me to expect. The contrast became even more striking when German prisoners began receiving letters from home describing conditions in their occupied homeland. While these men enjoyed adequate food, warm clothing, and medical care in British camps, their families faced Allied bombing, Soviet occupation, and the collapse of basic infrastructure. Many prisoners experienced profound guilt at their comfortable circumstances, while their countrymen suffered. This psychological conflict accelerated their ideological transformation. Werner Gottfried, a former Waffen-SS sergeant captured during the Falaise Pocket, experienced what he described as a moral awakening while imprisoned in Scotland. "I began to understand that the enemy I had been taught to hate possessed qualities of mercy and justice that my own government had systematically abandoned," he wrote in his post-war memoir. "The British treated us according to principles they held sacred, not according to how we had treated their prisoners." This consistency of character, even toward enemies, revealed to me the true nature of democratic civilization. British policy toward German prisoners reflected deeper currents in Anglo-Saxon political philosophy and military tradition. The decision to adhere strictly to Geneva Convention protocols even when dealing with soldiers from a regime that had systematically violated those same conventions, stemmed from a fundamental belief that civilized behavior must be maintained regardless of enemy conduct. Winston Churchill, despite his fierce determination to destroy Nazi Germany, insisted that British treatment of prisoners reflect the values for which we fight. This was not mere propaganda or political posturing. Internal government documents, classified for decades after the war, reveal consistent high-level commitment to humane treatment even when it created logistical challenges or limited intelligence gathering opportunities. The War Office Directive of July 1944 explicitly stated, "British honor demands that we demonstrate through our conduct toward enemy prisoners the moral superiority of democratic governance. We fight not to become like our enemies, but to prove ourselves worthy of victory." The re-education programs introduced in British POW camps represented perhaps the most ambitious attempt in history to transform enemy ideology through democratic example rather than coercion. Unlike Soviet or even American approaches, which often relied on heavy-handed indoctrination, British re-education emphasized exposure to democratic processes, free discussion, and access to uncensored information. German prisoners were encouraged to establish their own camp newspapers, elect representatives to negotiate with British administrators, and participate in educational programs that presented multiple viewpoints on political and social issues. The crown jewel of this effort was Wilton Park, a specially designed facility where carefully selected German prisoners attended intensive courses on democratic governance, free market economics, and the history of political liberalism. Many graduates of Wilton Park would later become leaders in post-war West Germany's reconstruction. Transformation of individual prisoners reflected broader changes in their understanding of power and authority. Under Nazi rule, German soldiers had experienced a system where might determined right, where loyalty was enforced through fear, and where questioning authority invited severe punishment. In British captivity, they encountered guards who explained rather than commanded, administrators who solicited their opinions on camp management, and a system that acknowledged their basic human rights even as enemies of the state. This exposure to democratic principles in daily operation proved more effective than any propaganda campaign could have been. Heinrich Böll, the future Nobel Prize-winning author who spent time as a British POW, later reflected, "The British did not try to convert us through speeches or films. They simply demonstrated, day after day, how decent people behave toward one another." This consistency of character, maintained even under the stresses of war, taught us more about the values of freedom than any classroom lecture. As months passed and German prisoners settled into routines of agricultural work, construction projects, and community integration, their letters home began to paint a picture that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had predicted. These letters, carefully monitored by British censors but rarely altered, provided German families with their first accurate glimpse of life under democratic rule. Prisoners described British farmers who invited them to family meals, guards who shared photographs of their children, and local communities that gradually embraced former enemies as neighbors and friends. The prohibition against fraternization, strictly enforced during the war years, was gradually lifted as victory became certain. By Christmas 1945, thousands of German prisoners were spending the holiday in British homes, sharing family celebrations with the very people they had been trained to regard as implacable enemies. The daily rhythm of tea service continued throughout their captivity, becoming a cherished ritual that many former prisoners would recreate in their post-war lives. The sight of British guards carefully preparing tea for German workers, maintaining this civilized tradition even in the midst of ongoing warfare, represented something profound about the nature of democratic society. It demonstrated that core values, respect for human dignity, commitment to decent treatment, maintenance of civilized customs, could survive even the brutality of total war. The tea ceremony became a daily reminder that their captors possessed something the Nazi regime had lost: the ability to maintain humanity in the face of inhumanity, to respond to hatred with decency, to prove their moral superiority through actions rather than proclamations. The agricultural work programs that employed over 160,000 German prisoners by 1946 created unprecedented opportunities for cultural exchange and mutual understanding. Working alongside British farmers, these former enemies learned not only agricultural techniques, but also the rhythms of democratic community life. They observed how British families made decisions through discussion rather than decree, how local communities resolved disputes through negotiation rather than force, and how individual dignity was maintained even in relationships of clear hierarchy. Many prisoners found themselves working for farmers whose sons were fighting in Germany, yet were treated with kindness and respect that transcended the artificial boundaries of nationality and war. This direct exposure to democratic values in practice proved more transformative than any theoretical instruction could have been. The statistical evidence of British humane treatment becomes overwhelming when compared to prisoner mortality rates in other Allied nations. While Soviet camps experienced German prisoner death rates exceeding 30%, and even American facilities recorded fatalities of 0.2%, British camps maintained a death rate of merely 0.03% lower than the mortality rate for British civilians during the same period. This remarkable record reflected not just adequate food and medical care, but a systematic commitment to treating enemy prisoners as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. German military doctors working in British POW camps consistently reported better medical supplies and facilities than they had possessed while serving in the Wehrmacht. Dr. Kurt Hanman, captured at El Alamein, noted in his clinical records, "The British have provided medical equipment and pharmaceuticals that allow me to practice medicine at a higher standard than I maintained even in peacetime Germany." By the winter of 1946, as repatriation programs began returning German prisoners to their devastated homeland, many experienced profound reluctance to leave British captivity. Over 25,000 chose to remain in Britain permanently, seeking civilian status and beginning new lives in the country they had once considered their mortal enemy. Their reasons were complex and feared Soviet occupation of their home regions. Others had formed romantic attachments to British women. Many simply recognized that Britain offered opportunities for a better life than war-torn Germany could provide. But underlying these practical considerations was a deeper transformation. These men had discovered that their former enemies possessed qualities of character that their own nation had lost. During its descent into totalitarian darkness, correspondence between former prisoners and their British hosts, which continued for decades after the war, provides intimate testimony to this transformation. Hans Müller, the young soldier who had trembled with fear aboard that LST in June 1944, maintained a lifelong friendship with the Yorkshire farming family that had employed him. In a letter written on the 40th anniversary of his capture, he reflected, "You taught me that strength is not shown by cruelty to the defeated, but by kindness to those who cannot defend themselves. You demonstrated that true victory lies not in crushing one's enemies, but in converting them into friends. The tea you shared with me each afternoon taught me more about civilization than all my years of education in Germany." The marriages between German prisoners and British women, 796 officially recorded. Unions with countless more informal relationships represented, perhaps the most profound symbol of transformation from enmity to acceptance. These relationships, initially forbidden and socially controversial, gradually gained acceptance as communities recognized the genuine character changes that had occurred in their former enemies. Local newspapers, which had once demanded harsh treatment for German prisoners, began featuring heartwarming stories of romance and redemption. The wedding of Hans Siegfried Valentin to Irene Hargreaves in Oswald-Wissel became a symbol of post-war reconciliation, attended by former guards, local farmers, and fellow prisoners who had chosen to make Britain their permanent home. The British government's re-education programs, while initially viewed with skepticism by many prisoners, ultimately succeeded beyond their designers' most optimistic expectations. The weekly publication Wochenpost, produced specifically for German POWs, provided uncensored news about global events, democratic theory, and post-war reconstruction plans. Prisoners participated in debates, attended lectures by British academics and politicians, and engaged in discussions that would have been impossible under Nazi rule. These intellectual exchanges, conducted in an atmosphere of mutual respect rather than coercion, allowed German prisoners to examine their own beliefs and assumptions without external pressure. Many later credited these discussions with providing them the intellectual tools necessary to contribute to West Germany's democratic reconstruction. The Christmas Invitation program of 1946 marked a decisive turning point in British-German prisoner relations. When Methodist minister Mr. Howe asked his M. Oswald-Wissel congregation whether they would welcome German prisoners into their homes for Christmas dinner, the overwhelming positive response surprised even liberal observers. 60 prisoners found themselves seated at British family tables, sharing Christmas meals with people whose cities had been bombed by the Luftwaffe, whose sons had died fighting the Wehrmacht, whose empire had been challenged by German U-boats. Yet these families chose to demonstrate the Christmas spirit of forgiveness and redemption rather than nurture hatred and resentment. The profound emotional impact on German prisoners cannot be overstated. Many later described this experience as their first genuine understanding of Christian charity and democratic tolerance, the practical work assignments that integrated German prisoners into British economic life created opportunities for relationship building that transcended the formal prisoner-captor dynamic. Prisoners working on construction sites learned British building techniques while teaching German efficiency methods to their supervisors. Those employed in factories contributed technical knowledge while absorbing lessons about labor relations in democratic societies. The agricultural workers, who comprised the largest single group, became integral parts of rural communities where their skills were valued and their personalities appreciated. These work relationships, built on mutual respect and shared purpose, demonstrated that cooperation was possible between former enemies when fundamental human dignity was maintained. The gradual relaxation of restrictions on prisoner movement and social interaction reflected British confidence in the success of their re-education efforts. By late 1947, German prisoners could leave their camps unescorted, visit local towns, attend cinema showings, and participate in community events. This remarkable level of freedom, unprecedented in POW history, was justified by consistently low escape rates and positive community integration. The trust demonstrated by British authorities encouraged prisoners to prove themselves worthy of such confidence. The few attempted escapes that did occur were often motivated more by homesickness than by any desire to return to military service or Nazi ideology. The profound psychological impact of respectful treatment extended beyond individual transformation to reshape German understanding of democratic governance. Prisoners who had lived under totalitarian rule for over a decade experienced firsthand how democratic societies function in practice. They observed how British guards were held accountable for their treatment of prisoners, how complaints could be filed and investigated, how rules applied equally to captors and captives. This exposure to democratic principles in operation proved more convincing than any theoretical explanation of democratic theory. Many prisoners later credited their British captivity with providing their first practical education in constitutional government, rule of law, and individual rights protection. As repatriation began in earnest during 1947. The reluctance of many prisoners to leave British captivity created unexpected administrative challenges. Men who had arrived as determined enemies now feared returning to a homeland they no longer recognized, ruled by occupying powers whose intentions remained unclear. The Britain they were leaving had become familiar, comfortable, even cherished. They had formed friendships, learned new skills, discovered new values, and experienced treatment that exceeded their wildest hopes. The prospect of returning to the devastation and uncertainty of occupied Germany held little appeal compared to the stability and opportunity they had found in British captivity. The final convoys of repatriated German prisoners departing British shores in late 1948 carried with them more than personal belongings and memories. They transported a fundamentally different understanding of what democratic civilization could achieve, how former enemies could become friends, and why the principles of human dignity and respect must be maintained even under the most difficult circumstances. Many would become leaders in West Germany's remarkable post-war recovery, bringing British learned lessons about democratic governance, economic cooperation, and international reconciliation. Their transformation from Nazi soldiers to democratic citizens represented one of history's most successful examples of ideological conversion through example rather than coercion. The tea ceremony, that daily ritual which had symbolized British commitment to civilized behavior throughout their captivity, took on almost mystical significance in prisoner memories. Decades later, former POWs gathering for reunions would invariably begin their meetings with the careful preparation and sharing of afternoon tea, recreating the moment each day when they had experienced proof that their captors possessed qualities of character their own regime had abandoned. The simple act of sharing tea had become a sacrament of transformation, a daily communion between former enemies that dissolved hatred through the persistent application of ordinary human kindness. The lessons learned from this remarkable experiment in democratic prisoner treatment would influence international law, military policy, and post-war reconstruction efforts for decades to come. The British model demonstrated that adherence to humanitarian principles, even toward one's enemies, could serve practical political purposes while maintaining moral integrity. The successful re-education and integration of German prisoners provided a template for future conflicts and occupations. Most importantly, it proved that democratic values possessed an inherent power to attract and convert even those who had been systematically indoctrinated against them. The correspondence files maintained by the British government reveal the long-term impact of humane prisoner treatment on international relations. Former German POWs became some of Britain's most effective advocates in post-war Germany, promoting trade relationships, cultural exchanges, and political cooperation. Their personal testimonies about British character and democratic values carried credibility that no propaganda campaign could have achieved. When West Germany joined NATO in 1955, many of the German officials involved in negotiations were former British prisoners who had experienced democracy in practice during their captivity. Hans Muller's final letter to his Yorkshire host family, written shortly before his death in 1989, provides perhaps the most eloquent testimony to the transformation achieved through respectful treatment. You saved more than my life when you treated me with dignity during those dark years. You saved my soul from the hatred that had been planted there by evil men. The tea we shared each afternoon was more than refreshment. It was a daily lesson in what human beings owe to one another, regardless of the uniforms we wear or the flags we serve. You taught me that true strength lies not in the ability to inflict suffering, but in the courage to show mercy. That lesson has guided my life for over 40 years, and I have tried to pass it on to my children and grandchildren. The Britain the first discovered in captivity was not the Britain I had been taught to expect, but the Britain I learned to love. In the end, the story of German prisoners in British hands during World War II illuminates profound truths about the nature of human dignity, the power of consistent moral behavior, and the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances. Britain's decision to treat enemy prisoners with respect and humanity, maintained even when their own cities were being bombed and their own soldiers were dying in battle, represented a triumph of civilized values over the brutality of total war. The daily ritual of afternoon tea, shared between former enemies in the fields and workshops of wartime Britain, became a symbol of everything that separates democratic civilization from totalitarian darkness. The recognition that every human being, regardless of nationality or allegiance, deserves to be treated with fundamental dignity and respect. This simple acknowledgement, demonstrated through thousands of small daily kindnesses rather than grand proclamations, possessed the power to transform hatred into friendship, enemies into allies, and war into the foundation for lasting peace.